Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alpha Staff webinar series. Today's webinar is Best Practices in Managing Unemployment with Alpha Staff's Pam Nading and Art Leisure. Before we begin, I'd like to address a brief technical overview. As you may have noticed, all attendee phone lines are muted and will remain so throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please send them using the chat or the Q&A feature. We'll be addressing as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Attendance in today's live webinar is approved for 1 CE credit with both HRCI and SHRM. At the end of the presentation, I'll share the contact information needed to request your credit. Alpha Staff is proud to be recognized by the National Association of State Workforce Agencies for outstanding performance in promoting integrity in the unemployment insurance system by utilizing the State Data Exchange System for unemployment claims. This is Alpha Staff's third year of recognition as a PEO for outstanding performance. This success is attributed to our outstanding unemployment department, and today I'll introduce two members of that department who have volunteered their time to share their knowledge with us. First, I'd like to introduce Pam Nading, Alpha Staff's Unemployment Hearing Business Partner. Pam has specialized in unemployment claims and SUTA tax management for 20 years. Pam has been managing unemployment claims and hearings at Alpha Staff since 2008. Prior to that, Pam has 15 years human capital experience and successfully managed employee relations, recruitment, and unemployment compensation cost control at $1 billion staffing company. I'd also like to introduce Art Leisure, Alpha Staff's unemployment claims supervisor. Art brings 14 years experience and is as an unemployment hearing officer for Florida's Department of Economic Opportunity and is a certified fraud examiner. Art's prior experience includes business analyst, air traffic control tower supervisor, and small business owner. Pam and Art, it's a pleasure to have you joining us today, and now I turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you all for joining today. We hope this is helpful and that we speak on the subjects that you're most wanting to hear about as it relates to controlling unemployment at your office. And something I'd like to say up front is please utilize the chat section or the question and answer section. I will reach an area in the webinar where I'll have an opportunity to address specific reasons for separation. So if there's something special that you're thinking about or that you have a question about that you'd like to ask, that would be an opportunity for me to address it there. And then of course, at the end, we will have an opportunity to address any additional questions you might have. So what will we be covering today? We'll be giving you a general overview of how unemployment works, how it's financed, how a person is determined eligible or disqualified, the requirements the state or federal government places on the employer, critical documents, best practices, things we've learned coming out of the pandemic, how we partner together, our mutual roles, what Alpha Staff calls its RFI project, or request for information. Next slide. So in our general overview, how is unemployment financed and how does the program work? It is mandated through the federal government. It actually came about in 1935 when Congress enacted the Social Security Act, and it was designed to provide temporary relief to individuals who lost their positions through no fault of their own. It started out with a very small compensation for a very short duration. Now, most states adhere to 26 weeks of unemployment benefits, and the amounts vary widely from as low as $275 per employee or per claimant weekly to $700 per employee weekly. It just depends on the state and the state provisions that have been established. Under the federal program, the federal government mandates that each state is allowed to set their own qualifying conditions, their own weekly benefit amount, what disqualifies an individual from receiving benefits and how they might requalify, their tax structure and how it's paid, and however, it must conform to certain federal provisions, including the adequacy and accuracy provisions that were entered into the law in 2008. Next slide. I put these in here today because I think we all would like to know how we're doing. How are the states doing? And it couldn't be more timely because there's so much information out right now over, are we going into a recession? Are the next 2 quarters going to be smooth sailing for employers as it relates to employment practices and unemployment? Or what do we think? Generally, I would say prepare for what might be a little bit of a bumpy time over the next 2 quarters. Coming out of the pandemic, certainly don't think it's going to be something like that, but we may see higher periods of unemployment. What this chart is showing us, and these numbers came out just this week, is that each state is ranked, and this particular chart shows us each state's ranking by alphabetical order so that you can quickly identify your state in the ranking. On the next slide, you actually see how each state is ranked, with Minnesota and Nebraska being the 2 top performers with the lowest unemployment rate, and New Mexico and the District of Columbia being the highest when it comes to their rate of unemployment. Nationally, our rate of unemployment right now is 3.6%, which is still significantly lower than what it was this time last year by over 2 basis points. Next slide. So how is unemployment financed? Well, it's financed through a tax, a payroll tax that is paid by the employer on the first wages earned by each employee annual. The amount of tax that's paid by an employer can vary significantly from a low of $8,000 per employee per year to New York that has a taxable wage base of $11,800, or Oregon where the taxable wage base is $43,000. So controlling this cost and what your percentage of taxes that you pay can vary greatly in the amount of tax you pay, because you're paying that on the first wages earned. Also to be considered in that calculation is turnover. If you're having rapid turnover, then every time you hire a new employee, you start paying tax on that person's wages up to that taxable wage amount. Pandemic unemployment benefits at this time, fortunately, have ended. I say fortunately because we're no longer considered in a pandemic. They varied by state. I do, however, still see adjudication. In fact, coming out of this pandemic, one of the things we've learned is that it feels like we're never going to get out of it, at least in terms of unemployment claims. We are still participating in claims and hearings that date back to 2020 that the state is still adjudicating. It's an extremely long process, and due to the pandemic and the very, very high volume of claims and also unemployment claims fraud, we are still working our way through that process on a claim-by-claim basis with each state to ensure that we're charged for only those claims that we should be charged for. The rate of tax that an employer pays, and why we consider that something that is extremely important, is because our rate is based on how many claims were lost. It's never our goal to prevent someone from collecting benefits who's genuinely entitled. If you tried to the very best of your ability on the job, but were let go due to poor performance, you're entitled to benefits. Or if you were laid off due to lack of work, due to a reduction in business, you're entitled to benefits. We do not contest those claims. We'll do everything we can to process them as quickly as possible. But those claims also impact the rate that an employer pays. However, we should not be paying on claims where the individual voluntarily quit, and Art will be talking about that, or if the individual was discharged for a work-connected reason that might be considered misconduct. An employer's rate of tax can also vary based on the size of their payroll, because the state looks at the health of the company and how much money you're contributing each quarter and year by year to see if that percentage that you have on file is consistent with a healthy balance should your workforce be laid off. And lastly, the employer's rate of tax that they pay is also based on the overall health of the state's general unemployment trust fund. Now, in 2021 and 2022, we saw the benefit of different types of pandemic assistance to the employers and to the states that was federally funded. Waiting to see what's going to happen in 2023. It may be that the health of some of those funds are going to be considered lower than what they've been in the past. So it's very possible that we will see less favorable rates in 2023 as a result of nothing more than the health of the state's unemployment trust funds. Next slide. So what are some, go ahead.
Thank you, Pam. I'll talk about eligibility and disqualification. In general, eligibility refers to the personal conduct and conditions of the claimant, and disqualification depends more upon their relationship and separation from their employer. To be eligible, a claimant has to be working less than full-time and earning less than the weekly benefit amount. They have to be able to work, available for work, and actively seeking employment. Next slide. Actively seeking work means a vigorous job search for work that they can reasonably expect to get. For instance, I can't look for work as a surgeon. I have to work with, something that comports with my experience. You also have to accept work, reasonable work, when it's offered. If you offer a claimant a position that has similar hours, duration, schedule, and duties to something that they had before, and they refuse it, that's something you're going to want to let us know about. And you want to also let us know the specifics of the job offer and how it was conveyed. You also want to let the employee know that if they refuse, it can impact their benefits. Next slide. Actively seeking employment. That's typically between the state and the claimant. You will rarely have a hearing where you're involved in something like that. That's where they'll ask the claimant about the specifics of their job search. Unlike pre-pandemic, restricting your job search to online and remote work is no longer would make someone ineligible. That's something that a lot of people are doing. They started doing during the pandemic. And so you're going to have a lot of claimants that will restrict their job search in that manner. There are some additional eligibility requirements. Prior earnings. They have to have earned a certain amount to recharge their unemployment battery. And this is not specifically an eligibility issue, but they have to have separated from the last employer for good work-related reasons considered beyond their control or for good cause. Next slide. There's some additional things too, like monetary eligibility, but there's an hour presentation. We don't need to get into that, but it's something that we're well aware of. Disqualify conditions. Next slide. Disqualification is for quitting without good cause attributable to the employer or being discharged for work-related misconduct. Work-related misconduct is, in general, willful, negligent. It's not isolated unless it's something that's so egregious that it would be considered either illegal or immoral. Something that caused harm to the employer, And the moving party in the separation will have the burden of proof. If the claimant quits, they'll have the burden of proving that it was for good cause attributable to the employer. Likewise, if the claimant is discharged, the employer will have the burden of proving that it was for misconduct connected with work. If the claimant is disqualified, they will be disqualified until they're reemployed and have earned wages equal to between 4 and 17 times the weekly benefit amount, and have separated for non-disqualifying reasons from that employer. Next slide. Poor performance versus misconduct. If you're discharging someone, what would prevent them from getting benefits? Poor performance cannot do the job, is genuine incompetence. If someone is simply unable to do the job, that would generally not be disqualifying unless they misrepresented their qualifications on their application for employment. If the claimant tried to the best of his or her ability to perform the duties associated with the job, failure to adequately perform is not based on any willful action or neglect on the part of the claimant, but just a lack of ability. Then you may have good business reasons for discharging them, but they'd in general still be able to get benefits. Misconduct will not do the job. The claimant has not worked to the best of their ability. The failure to adequately perform the job is due to some willful action or repeated neglect that causes the company harm. Generally, it's carelessness or negligence to such a degree or recurrence that it constitutes or is comparable to deliberately harming the employer's interests. Claimant is fully aware of the consequences. That's not always true. If the discharge is for violation of the employer's policy, then the claimant needs to be aware that that's what would happen if they did that. Now, there'd be some cases where we were talking about something immoral or illegal. You don't need to specifically spell that out in your employee handbook. Yeah, if you rob from us, you're going to be discharged. That's common sense. A reasonable, prudent person should know that would result in their dismissal. Next slide.
Thank you, Art.
Thanks,
So let's talk about employer compliance. Next slide. Way back when, we used to see more claims where individuals would say, well, what if we want the person to collect? We really liked Mary, and we really just don't want to bother with that claim. We don't want you to protest the claim. What we would say, hopefully we say it very nicely, but what we would say is that it's no longer an issue that the employer can voluntarily decide. In 99% of the states, we are required to provide timely, accurate, adequate information or face penalty. And the penalty can be very significant. For example, if I fail, according to the state's position, to provide them with timely, accurate, adequate information, and say 3 times, even though we're a very, very, very large employer, I could face penalty. Not only would I lose my right to protest that claim, I might lose the right to protest other claims for the remainder of that year. Or if it was found that we failed to provide them with information, went to a hearing, and then we supplied them with all of the information, we can be penalized that way, because the state says, well, we went to all this process, and if you had provided us this information up front, we would not have paid benefits, and we would not be going through this process. So it's very important that what's stated to the claimant at the time they're being dismissed is what's communicated to Alpha staff. And by the same token, if it's a claim that you do want us to protest, and if the person was discharged from work-connected misconduct or voluntarily resigned without good cause, and you've had communication with them, then that conversation should never start with, we've decided that today's going to be your last day and that we're just ending your employment, because it would give the impression that the reason for separation was due to a layoff. So we want to make sure that we clearly identify exactly to the individual why they're being let go, and discuss that with them. Next slide. So what are some of the best practices that we can follow in managing unemployment, and in all cases, in reducing that cost, because we have fairly and accurately documented what should be documented? What are some of the best practices? One, document the behavior that is not acceptable as quickly as possible. And when you make that documentation, it's not just that you tell me your conclusion, but that you share on that form the facts, so that any individual looking at that form would draw the same conclusion. If you said you were late constantly and this needs to change, and if it doesn't change now, it's going to result in further disciplinary action up to and including termination. What you failed to share with me is, what days were you absent or late? What time were you scheduled to be there? And incorporate into that documentation, which can be a supplemental page, the person's time and attendance record. It's so much easier to have that information and put it together, show it to the individual, and it's part of that warning notice, that disciplinary action, that if we need it, you've got all of the facts. And you look at it, you say, oh, I'm so glad I did this at the time I did it, and not when it was needed. One of the most important things to remember about unemployment, and it came up during the pandemic, so this is one of those lessons learned, that during the pandemic, we had many, many, many unemployment claims, 10 times the volume. Where we might have had 2,000 claims, we had 20,000 claims. And while most of those claims were for individuals who separated due to no fault of their own, the little needles in the haystack were claims interdispersed in the layoff claims for individuals who were discharged due to work-connected misconduct or quit without good cause, had nothing to do with the pandemic. Documenting that information and making sure that it's in our PRISM system, or that you've provided us with that information, can make all of the difference, because when our computer system is putting that information together, if you provided it, we have it. But if you've not provided it and we've got 20,000 claims in the system, it makes it very difficult for us to make sure we're providing the state with that other requirement, the timely, accurate, adequate information. Along with that documentation, be objective. Remember, what's the purpose of our warning? It's to identify behavior that needs to change. So in being objective, hopefully what we've done is identify the behavior, encourage the change, but at the same time, we've not attacked the individual. We've kept it objective in how we've communicated to the individual that behavior that the employer would like to see remedied. Next. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say next slide. Go back. I do apologize. Terminate weak performers who show little or no improvement as quickly as possible. Why? Because in some states, for example, Georgia, South Carolina, Illinois, the employer is liable if you're the last employer. So if there is no probation period, well, I'll get to that. In some cases, there's a very, very, very short probation period, but our liability begins right away. For example, in Illinois, it doesn't matter what you paid the individual. Once that person has worked 30 days, the employer is 100% liable for the claim. And you theoretically could pay in unemployment benefit charges more than what you paid the person in wages if they're determined eligible for the full entitlement and say they worked for you only 30 days. So it's important that you utilize the performance improvement, performance appraisals, so that their behavior is identified. And if the individual is not meeting your standard, that you've made that clear. With cases involving misconduct, remember, unemployment eligibility is final incident driven. Terminate the individual when the final incident was within their control. You could have a very clear case following the employer's progressive disciplinary process. The final incident, though, is not in line with the other prior instances, and as a result, lose. And it could be very frustrating. I appreciate that because you feel all the right things, but the final incident was not related to the previous warnings. Keep in mind, what was the purpose of our warning? It was to identify behavior that was not acceptable, that we would like to see change. So if that's not part of the behavior at the time of termination, then those past warnings are not going to be considered. The state typically will not allow us to group and say violations of company policy. And by that, what we mean is they violated attendance policy over here, and they violated some other policy about sharing confidential information over here. And then the final incident was for some other policy that they violated. The state really wants to see consistency in the employer's record. Allow resigning employees to work out their notice. This one is really critical in some states, more so than others. For example, state of Florida and Virginia, if an individual gives notice of their intent to resign and you meet with a person, you say, thank you for the 2 weeks notice, but I've decided today is your last day and it will not be necessary for you to work out the notice period, that's fine. The state will pay benefits through the notice period or the remainder of that 2 weeks. However, at the end of the 2-week period, the unemployment claim would be adjudicated under the reason for separation. So if they resigned, the employer is not going to be charged anything other than maybe a week or two of unemployment benefits. But let's take that claim and move it to California. In California, if an individual voluntarily resigns and the employer says, hey, it's okay, you know, I'd like to change and let today be your last day. Thank you anyway. You've just converted that resignation to a discharge. So unless the reason for separation under a discharge would constitute misconduct on that day, my recommendation is that you pay the person through the full notice period. Let them know that it's not necessary that they come into the office or that it's not necessary that they even perform specific tasks, that if you need them, that you'll certainly reach out and that you will be paying them through the notice period so that you don't convert that claim. California, that's an easy, almost $12,000 charge on a claim where someone voluntarily quit. We respect the fact that there are times when you might say, it was really good news today that so-and-so came in and resigned, but resist letting them go on that day unless you're willing to pay them through the notice period. Of course, best practice, and I did talk about it, provide us with timely, accurate, adequate information. And lastly, in best practices, upload that documentation to HR Prism documents. Next slide. When reviewing documentation, one of the other things that I'd like you to consider is the length of time between warnings. If you're pulling a warning that's from 2018, another one from 2020, and now they're discharged in 2022, the length of time between those warnings is probably so long that the state is not going to consider it. Generally, the state's looking for something at least within the year. And keep in mind the length of time that person's been with you and the severity of the warning. What was it for? If I was having an attendance problem in 2018, but then I corrected it, and then I had another attendance problem in 2020, but then I corrected it. And I'm arguing that it was beyond my control. And then you fire me in 2022. The information that you have in 2022 is probably what's going to be considered predominantly. And we'll want to look at what that was. So providing us with time and attendance. And when a person, say in the case of absenteeism, if a person is out and the individual contacts you by text message, and I know some employers don't like text messages. We in the unemployment claims department, we love text messages. People will resign on text messages. They will tell you exactly what they think in a text message. Your replying shows that you were quick and responsive to what the need was. So if you have someone who is providing you with documentation in the form of a text message, please keep that with your documentation. It's extremely helpful. Make sure with your documentation that it's legible. Literally this morning, I had a hearing. The claimant was discharged, temporary employer, because she wrote a note and put it on the dashboard of someone's car. A co-worker got mad because she took 2 parking spaces. And so the person in Spanish wrote, "Learn how to drive, idiot." And so the girl found the note. She was upset. When she went out, she shared it with her employer. The employer brought up their surveillance video, and they saw my claimant walk by, and they believe she was probably the one that wrote the note, although they couldn't tell from their surveillance video if she put it. But the copy that we had in the file that we were able to use as evidence was so bad that my referee kept saying, "I can't tell what this says. I can't read what this says." So it's really important that the information that you provide to us is legible, that you've provided us with a quality copy. If you can, send it to us in PDF attachments. Sometimes when I know when you're doing things quickly, you will copy and paste into an email. But when we put that in PDF in order to send it to the state, because they are very limited, even though we can respond online, they are very limited in how they see that documentation. The better quality copy you give us, the more we can do to work with that document. Our view is the state's extremely busy. They need for us to point out the facts of the case. And so we try and do that as clearly as we can by marking the file, by highlighting things, by documenting. And so the better your documentation, the better we'll do at providing them with that evidence. Make sure when it comes to supporting evidence that you've included it. I did talk about that. If an individual refuses to sign, make sure that you have somebody who is there and actually signs as well. And one of the things that I say about witnesses, and I'm touching on it now instead of on the next slide, actually is if you have somebody that is attending your meeting where you're issuing corrective counseling, that person's job is not just to listen and observe what's said. That person should be taking notes of what's being said during the meeting, because when it's over, the person that was talking might not remember everything that was said. Your function, if you're the witness, is to make sure as much as possible that you've documented, or at least document after the meeting so that you have that clear picture of what was covered. And again, supporting evidence, text message, time and attendance, emails. In terms of documentation, we absolutely need those prior warnings related to the reason for separation. And is the infraction based on a written policy? And again, we're looking at either your operations or employee handbook. Next slide. What are some of the documents that we'd like to receive when we're contesting a claim? Here's our list. And one of the best things about this is that you can find all of these documents inside PRISM. Every document listed here, with the exception of maybe one, like the resignation statement, is available to you through PRISM. And I'm going to review today as we go through these documents where you can find it or how you can complete them. And in some cases, you can complete more than one function simultaneously to save you time. The employee handbook acknowledgement, we have that. If we are electronically onboarding your new hires, then when they're filling out their new hire paperwork, they're acknowledging the relationship between Alpha staff and our client, and they're also signing the employee handbook acknowledgement, which is exactly what we need if it's required that the employer have the burden of proof. In terms of your handbook, if we're doing your electronic onboarding, I also have your handbook. Or if we're not doing your onboarding and you have shared your handbook, then we have it on file here. In cases where we do not have a copy, we'll reach out to you and ask that you send us a copy. And if you're not utilizing it today, keep in mind that our HR department is happy to work with you on your handbook if it needs tweaking, updating, or you'd like us to review. That's part of the services that we provide. Employee disciplinary action. The Alpha staff has an employee disciplinary action notice, and you can find that in the Alpha staff resource library, and I'll show you how to get there. Witness statements, that obviously would be something that you would create, but anytime, and I had a witness statement this morning, it helped me in my hearing. What it did not have, unfortunately, was it was not signed or dated. And in this case, the person was no longer with the company, so I couldn't say, could you go back to this person and ask them to sign it? So I had a witness statement. It was handwritten. It was well written, but unfortunately it was not signed nor dated. So when you get witness statements, make sure that we can read the signature. If we can't read it, please print the person's name underneath it. Ideally, I'd love to know their position as well, but we can look it up, and dated. Employee time and attendance and documentation that pertains to the occurrence. Definitely something we would need if we were dealing with an unemployment claim related to an attendance issue. And again, we would ask that you keep that supporting documentation if you're issuing corrective counseling with the corrective counseling. So if it's needed, we have it available. What would that be? Well, if the person failed to work their schedule, and the schedule varies, we would need to have a copy of the schedule. We would also need to see the days and times that they worked during the period that you identified this individual as being either absent or late. We would also want to know, why was this person absent or late? Did they follow your policy? Did they call in 2 hours prior to the start of the shift and advise you why? And most importantly, did someone write down what occurred? Or better yet, did they send you a text message and say, hey, I'm going to be late today. I've got this problem. Those are the types of things that are extremely helpful in allowing the employer to satisfy the burden of proof. Again, it's not our desire to win cases that we should not win, but we absolutely don't want to lose cases where you discharged for work-connected misconduct, especially after the business was harmed because that person wasn't there to do their job, or because perhaps you had added overtime because someone else had to step in, or because maybe it hindered your client relationship with your vendors or clients because you were inadequately staffed at the time. We want to support you in those things. Performance appraisals. Appraise an individual at least within the first 90 days, maybe sooner depending on the position, as soon as you have an idea of whether or not they're going to work out. And you will find in the Alpha Staff Resource Library a sample performance appraisal. Make sure if somebody lets you know with regard to resignation statements that if they come up and they let you know they're resigning, or I had a hearing again this week where the individual resigned by text message. The employer sent the individual a performance improvement plan. The performance improvement plan did not change the person's rate of pay, did not change the person's hours, but was going to put them in a strict training environment for the next 90 days. And the individual reviewed it, and the very next day, instead of starting on the performance improvement plan, sent a text message saying, hey, I've reviewed this. I've been in this position for 12 years with other companies, and I'm not willing to go back to this kind of environment. Thank you anyway, but I've already accepted another job. Thank you for the opportunity. The client immediately wrote back and said, thank you for letting us know. We certainly wish you well. Sounds clear cut, right? Well, I get the unemployment claim. He has appealed. I look at the file on the hearing, and the claimant has said the employer was reducing my salary by over 30%. There was no way I could live on that. And I also feel that this may have been in some way motivated by other reasons. We had the text message. We sent it in, needless to say. And it was also a document that we sent to the claimant. The claimant didn't pursue his appeal, which happens often nowadays. If we've got the documentation to show that we can lay out our case effectively and we're likely to win based on the evidence, it's not uncommon for the hearing not to take place. Oh, it's true, we would have done all that work up front, but it's still a win. A win is a win. So be sure that you keep that documentation, even related to resignations, no matter how it's provided. Exit interview. There is an exit interview form in the Alpha Staff Resource Library. And the notice of employee separation form that you're probably all familiar with, you can find in a multitude of ways through Alpha Staff. It's in the Alpha Staff Forms Library, and it's also in the Alpha Staff Resource Library. Next slide. This is a picture, and some of you may recognize it right away. If you have access to Prism and you're actually documenting in Prism, then you know right where this is. I'm in the employee details screen of one of our internal employees, James Bond, who is in one of our sample clients out there for us to test in a test environment. And so one of the places that we would love to see you place your documents is in the document section inside Prism. And the way you do this is simply by bringing up the employee, going over to the far right tab where it's highlighted and it says, but it's not easy to read, actions, select actions, and then select documents to the right, just underneath that. The box directly in front will open, and you will see there the documents that are already there if you are an onboarding client, or you have the option to load documents. Now, this is a great place for you to load that corrective disciplinary action form, the attendance record, the notice of employee termination form. However, I'm going to show you another way to use that, and we will actually do it for you. But please utilize this section because, again, lessons learned from the pandemic. Claims volume increases exponentially, and it's very possible that your support staff in the HR field may be limited as well. So we will be reaching out to you, requiring information on a multitude of people. When you have that information, if you will document it in here, we have access, we can review it, we can download it, we can even answer the claim in many cases based on the information that you provided. If it's sufficient, and if it's not, we'll reach out, or if you've requested that we reach out to you, we'll reach out to let you know. Next slide. This is within Alpha Staff. You know, when you log into Prism, one of the first screens you see has tabs on it, and I have selected here the HR tab. And when you select the HR tab, under the HR tab, if you're someone that goes into the system and terminates people, you're going to go there to the left where I've highlighted employee termination. But I also want to share with you today two other areas of resource that I've been talking about, and that's under HR/Alpha Staff. And here you have the Alpha Staff Forms Library as well as the Resource Library. Next slide. This is when I've selected the Alpha Staff Forms Library. And in the Alpha Staff Forms Library, you can easily select the button I've highlighted in orange, Notice of Separation. So when you click on that button, next slide, the following document will automatically open. This is the automated Notice of Employee Separation form. In this form, you can do two things simultaneously, saving you time. And we all need to save time, right? As you complete this form, it is also documenting what you write on this form inside Prism on that person's specific detail record. So you're selecting the employee and it'll auto-populate as you start typing in the name of the employee so that the full name is exactly right. It will put in system fill, the last four digits of the Social Security number, and then it will ask you for the last day worked here. I think I was originally doing James Bond, so I put in that James was fired just a couple of days ago. I put in his last day worked. I put in his termination date. I noted that he was eligible for rehire. You know, we all love James Bond, so in his case, I made him eligible for rehire. I selected the separation category in the middle section where it says reason for separation. In this case, misconduct. And in James' case, it was a willful refusal to follow directions. And also very helpful, in the termination explanation, you have an opportunity to document in detail what occurred. That section is going to show up in the termination explanation section inside Prism. So everything you've done up to this point will also populate in Prism, saving you time. The other thing that will populate for you, which is helpful to know, is the box that says validation messages. If you are completing this for a specific state, the computer knows that, oh, in certain states, you may need to provide this employee with information within certain periods of time to be in compliance with wage and hour issues. So this is a way to do it. This is step one. Next slide. This is step two. After you've completed that very easy section that you just saw, you have an opportunity to drag and drop documents in here. So in it, you can go attach, but you can just pull open and start dragging in documents that you'd like us to have. And when you've completed that, you hit next, and I say next slide. Let me also say, you don't need to go back, but on slide two or on step two, you can send us videos, you can send us audio, you can send us ping, you can send us TIFF, you can send us text, you can send us Excel, and it accepts a large volume. So in most cases, your files are not going to reach the exceeded standard. Step three, it will ask you to confirm what you've written. And in this case, it says that this employee, in the example that was here, was somebody that was sleeping on the job. Next slide. When you've completed, it will send you confirmation that you've completed the form. It will advise you that the employee has been updated in Prism, and you will receive an email. Next slide. Before I go on, that information is then sent to Alpha Staff's payroll department, the unemployment claims department, as well as the garnishment department. We all receive a copy of the notice of separation. We all receive a copy of the supporting documentation that you've provided. And when it hits the Alpha Staff unemployment claims department, we will actually upload that into the documents section or check to see if it's there on your behalf. But the good part is you've simultaneously done two things at once. You've completed the employee termination, and you've filled out the necessary documentation that we received, and you've had an opportunity to send us all those supporting documents because you've drag and dropped the corrective counseling, you've drag and dropped the attendance record, you've drag and dropped the resignation statement or whatever it pertained to. What other resources does Alpha Staff have? Well, we talked about the Alpha Staff Forms Library, where you can fill out the notice of separation. We also have the resource library. And in the resource library, next slide, and you can get to it a number of ways. I was just showing you how you could get to it on the last screen, right? I like to, if I'm looking for a form, I typically like to use the search function. So I've highlighted the word search up here to the left, but you could also search by category. I ran for this one, employee disciplinary action, and this is actually quite a long document. I simply, for the purposes of displaying it here, showed you a few forms, but you will find all of those forms. This is one of them, the employee disciplinary action form. And you'll find that in the library that we were just discussing. Now, what about this particular form? Just to talk on it briefly so that I don't go over in time. Probably the one area where we need this form the most and we don't get it is in the termination. Documenting the termination on the notice of separation form is helpful, but we still need that final incident documented. Please remember when you are using this form that the progressive discipline stops with the termination, and that we need you to complete this document providing us with specific details about what occurred as the final incident and why this person was discharged, and have it signed by the person that's administering it, witnessed by another individual, because usually the claimant does not sign this document. It's simply the way it goes. Include all of that detailed supporting information, and you can drag and drop it into the notice of separation and we've got it. Or you can send it to us and we'll have it that way through email. Next form. This is the notice of employee separation. You know, you can find the same form that you filled out through the forms library. Here it is again in the resource library. You may have people in the field that need to fill this form out. So here's one, it's available through the resource library, and you have an opportunity to select the various reasons for separation, complete the document, and provide the same needed information, but above all, please document what's occurring with the individual. Next slide. This is just a better view of some of the categories that are listed on the form, from misconduct to voluntary separations with or without notice, poor performance, lack of work, and then other reasons that usually fit into reasons that would entitle a person to benefits. Next slide. What are some of the special provisions related to unemployment? In Florida, we have the benefit of 90 days or less. The state is more strict about this now in Florida. If a person is told within the first 7 days of hire that the first 90 days are probationary, then that individual, if separated due to poor work performance, will be entitled to benefits and the employer is not charged. However, I need to show that they were trained, or that you attempted to train, that they knew that their job was in jeopardy, and that there was a final incident where the employer made the determination that you're just not working out and we've decided to move forward and let you go today because you're simply not meeting the standard that we had in mind for the position. And you got to let them know exactly why you're letting them know, or why you're letting them go, or the claimant's going to say, that's not true. I was terrific there. This was all about a personality conflict with the other person that was in the office. And unfortunately, that does happen. So again, Florida, 90 days or less. Georgia, very, very small, because the employer liability starts when you've paid $3,300 in wages and the last employer is chargeable. So in Georgia, I would just say, do it as quickly as possible. Illinois, you have 30 working days or less. Maine, an individual who is employed 5 or fewer weeks, the employer will not be liable for. Missouri, 28 days. North Carolina, 100 days. Virginia, 30 working days or 240 hours. And those provisions where you have days or hours are similar to Florida. You need to be able to show that you let them go because they were not meeting your minimum standard of performance. They all apply. Next slide. So how do we partner together? Next slide. What's your role? What we'd like you to do is continue to utilize Alpha Staff HR managers. The reason? Because although we are experts in the field of unemployment, the role that the HR manager does is provide you with general guidance, considering all of the potential liabilities that an employer might have. So utilize that HR manager. Certainly run it past us if you have questions about whether or not this person would be entitled to benefits. Do I have the documentation? Do you think the state will see this as misconduct? Is there anything specific? You're welcome to reach out to our team. 2, what's your role? Timely respond to our inquiries, because we've got to be timely, accurate, and provide adequate information, or we'll lose our right of protest. 3, if you receive a claim, please send it to us right away. Even in some states, even if the claim was mailed to the wrong address, if they got it to your address, then we are going to be considered liable. So it's very important that you communicate to your field offices, as well as your office, that if you get something in the mail, send it to us right away. Follow the best practices. Provide us with the reason for separation and use the supporting evidence, and absolutely upload the documentation, because we never know. We're hoping that this is going to be a wonderful rest of the year, but in the event we end up in high periods of unemployment, if you provided us with that documentation already, we're going to be able to do our job that much better and not hinder you in trying to do yours. Next slide. What's our role? We certainly have one, right? We receive most of your claims electronically. You saw at the beginning of this presentation that Alpha Staff was recognized by the State Information Data Exchange through NASWA, which is the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, for our integrity, for our efforts in reducing fraud by using the most secure resource available in communicating to the state why an individual left when vulnerable information, including an individual's social security number, is listed on documents. And in some cases, that's the way the state sends it, and that's the way it's communicated back. We will respond to your claims timely and accurately, electronically, or the ones that you send to us. Be mindful of the deadline, please, because usually it's 10 days or less. We will reach out to you if we need separation information, but we're going to look in our file first and see if we've already got what we need, and then ask you for what we do need in addition to what we've already got. We'll timely respond to all of the information the state asks for, but it's very common for the state to say, I need more information, and I need it within 24 to 48 hours. So if you get a request from either Sierra or Alexandria, Alex, saying, this is a 24, 48-hour request, we apologize for the short nature of the request. It's because they're only giving us 48 hours to get them everything else that they want. So please be mindful of those deadlines. Again, if you're documenting as you go, hopefully it'll be easier. We will file that official claim response with the state. We monitor the claims. If we disagree, we will reach out to you and let you know that we've received an unfavorable response and provide you with an opinion on whether or not we think it should be further pursued. And fortunately, because you're working with a PEO, we're able to represent you in almost every state in unemployment hearings. There are very few. South Carolina is one that comes to mind, where they require that the individual be a licensed practicing attorney. But in almost every state, because you're with the PEO, we can represent you at unemployment hearings. Next slide. Just to introduce our team, you met Art today. Alex Sandoval has been with Alpha staff for a little over a year, but her knowledge in unemployment law specific is very similar to mine. She came from a company that specialized in unemployment claims management and was there for many, many years. So she's very gifted and very qualified in understanding what we need. Sierra Carlson came from the state of Arizona, has worked with appeals, and was also a claims adjudicator. So she's completely aware of what the state is looking at in determining whether or not the individual should be eligible or not. You know me, I've been around for years. My name's Pam Nading, and I handle your unemployment hearings. And our best way for you to contact us is to use the group unemployment claims email. If you do, then you reach out to all of us at the same time. Next slide. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much for that. There was a lot of great information. I had a question regarding the terminations in PRISM, because you described a process whereby you're terminating via the Alpha Staff Forms Library. I think most often our clients will go into simply enter termination in that search bar at the top, and then you're entering, there's a brief place there for an explanation, but it's not nearly as detailed as what you went through the Alpha Staff Forms Library. Do you suggest all terminations be done through that forms library, or what's your recommendation there? Is it just some of the more maybe complex ones?
I would say because you want to document the reason for separation and have that document on file if it's ever needed, I would say use the forms library. But what I will also say is that when you're using the forms library, you need to have your, when you get ready to do a process, you need to have your paperwork ready. So that if you're filling out a reason for separation and the reason for separation was misconduct, and you're going to document in there the explanation of why they were let go, you want to kind of be ready for that, or have it somewhere else and you're going to copy and paste it off of the disciplinary action notice. But because it allows you to simultaneously do both, because I don't like a lot of extra work or writing. I just wrote that date. Why do I have to write it again? This eliminates that need. So if you want to do it, you can do it either way. I would say try it out and decide which works best for you. But whatever you write in the notes section of the notice of employee separation will show up as the termination explanation in PRISM.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to all of our attendees out there, if you do have questions, feel free to use the chat feature. Even though I know we're running close to being done on time, we'll still collect those questions and answers and get those responses to you. Just a reminder that if you want a copy of today's presentation or to receive your HRCI or SHRM credit, feel free to reach out to Alpha staff. You can reach out via email at hrsc@alphastaff.com, or you can contact us via phone at 888-335-9545. And just a couple of closing remarks here. So one is mark your calendar for our next webinar on August 11th. It's the fourth in our management series, and it's about giving transformative feedback with Alpha staffs Cindy Williams and Tony Solana. And then please take a couple of minutes to provide your feedback about today's webinar and the brief survey that will appear as a link once the webinar ends. We do read all of the feedback and take your suggestions into consideration for future webinars. Thank you, Pam and Art, for your time today. Thank you, attendees. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time. And guys, it looks like most of the presenters are dropping off, so I think we are good to end. Oh, I have a question here about the recorded webinar. Recorded webinars are actually posted to our website. So if you visit www.alphastaff.com, you'll see there's a contact or a link there for employer resources. And under that, you'll see business webinars. And all of the past webinars can be found there.